The midday sun blazed over the quiet suburban streets of Ridgewood, casting long shadows on the rows of tidy houses and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know each other, a place where appearances often mattered more than truth. On this particular afternoon, a sleek black sedan rolled slowly down the main road, its tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. Inside the car sat Marcus Hill, a tall man in his early 50s with a commanding presence. His tailored suit and polished demeanor hinted at a life of accomplishment, but Marcus carried himself with a humility that set him apart. As the Attorney General of the state, he had spent years fighting for justice and equality, often against overwhelming odds. Today, however, he wasn't headed to a courthouse or a press conference. He was on his way to visit an old friend, a retired teacher who had played a pivotal role in his life. Marcus adjusted his tie and glanced at the GPS on his dashboard. He smiled faintly as he remembered Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had inspired him to pursue law, but his smile faded as he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing him, its siren blaring. Frowning, Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, his car coming to a smooth stop. He rolled down his window and waited, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. The officer who approached was young, with a buzz cut and a rigid posture. His badge glinted under the harsh sunlight, but his expression was anything but welcoming. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone cold and commanding. Marcus nodded, reaching for his wallet. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You're driving suspiciously slow," the officer replied, narrowing his eyes. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus's brows furrowed slightly, but he kept his voice even. "I'm visiting a friend." The officer's eyes flicked over Marcus's suit and the interior of his car, his skepticism evident. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" For a moment Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights, but he also knew the dangers of escalating a situation like this. With a measured nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his movements deliberate and calm. As Marcus stood by the side of the road, the officer began searching his car without permission, tossing items aside with a dismissive air. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," the officer muttered. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Years of experience had taught him that restraint often carried more power than confrontation. Still, anger simmered beneath his composed exterior. The officer straightened, holding a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. "You're under arrest." Marcus's heart pounded, but he complied, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the cuffs snapping around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. The officer radioed in the arrest, his tone casual, as if this were just another routine stop. But this wasn't routine. Not for Marcus, and certainly not for the officer, who was about to learn the truth about the man he had just wrongfully detained. As Marcus stood by the police cruiser, his wrists uncomfortably restrained, a small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. The flashing lights of the cruiser had drawn attention, and a mix of curiosity and unease rippled through the bystanders. Among them was an elderly woman carrying a canvas shopping bag. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and her sharp eyes darted between Marcus and the officer. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a retired librarian known in the neighborhood for her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude. She had spent her life advocating for fairness, whether it was fighting for funding at the local library or standing up to bullies on behalf of the kids she mentored. "Excuse me, officer," Mrs. Carter called out, stepping closer. Her voice was firm but polite, the kind of tone that carried authority without aggression. "What's going on here?" The officer turned, his expression tightening. "This is police business, ma'am. Please step back." Mrs. Carter didn't budge. She adjusted her glasses and peered at Marcus. Recognition flickered in her eyes, though she couldn't quite place where she'd seen him before. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said calmly. "I know when something doesn't feel right. What's this man being arrested for?" The officer's jaw tightened, clearly irritated. "He fits the description of a suspect." "Now please step back." Mrs. Carter's sharp eyes narrowed. "Fits the description, does he? And what description might that be? Marcus, who had remained silent up to this point, glanced at her. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he felt a flicker of gratitude. There was something about her presence that felt steadying, like an anchor in the storm. "Ma'am," Marcus said gently, his voice calm and measured, "I appreciate your concern, but it's best not to escalate things." Mrs. Carter shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "Nonsense. Escalation happens when good people stay quiet." Turning back to the officer, she crossed her arms. "You're arresting this man for looking out of place in his own car? Do you even know who he is?" The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her confidence. "He hasn't identified himself." Mrs. Carter tilted her head, her expression sharpening. "And did you bother asking before slapping those cuffs on him?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Carter didn't give him the chance. She turned to the crowd, her voice rising just enough to be heard. "Anyone here have a phone? Start recording. I think this situation deserves a bit more transparency." Several bystanders pulled out their phones, their cameras trained on the scene. The officer's posture stiffened, and a flicker of unease crossed his face. "There's no need for that," he muttered, his bravado faltering. Mrs. Carter's focus returned to Marcus, her voice softening. "Young man, is there someone I can call for you? A lawyer, perhaps?" Marcus's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I think the truth will sort this out soon enough." Mrs. Carter studied him, her sharp intuition sensing there was more to him than met the eye. "You're awfully calm for someone being treated so unfairly." Marcus met her gaze, his tone even. "I've learned that losing your composure often costs more than it's worth." Her eyes twinkled with something that might have been admiration. "Smart man," she said quietly. "I just hope this officer here is as quick to learn." Mrs. Carter's intervention had shifted the energy of the situation. The officer, clearly aware of the growing scrutiny, began to falter in his authority. Meanwhile, Marcus felt a strange sense of reassurance. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, much less someone like Mrs. Carter, unassuming yet fiercely courageous. The stage was set for the truth to unfold, and Marcus could sense that this encounter would not end the way the officer expected. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down on Marcus as he stood by the police cruiser, his wrists still bound by cold, unyielding cuffs. The weight of the moment pressed on him, not just because of his personal discomfort but because of the greater implications of what was happening. Marcus Hill wasn't just another man pulled over for driving through the wrong neighborhood. He was the Attorney General, the highest legal authority in the state. And yet, here he was reduced to a stereotype, judged not by his character or achievements but by the color of his skin. Internally, Marcus grappled with a storm of emotions. Pride urged him to reveal his identity, to watch the officer's face crumble under the weight of his mistake. But something deeper held him back. If I use my title to escape this, what does that say about the countless others who can't? He thought of the many cases he'd fought for, the lives impacted by systemic prejudice, and the painful irony of now standing in their shoes. Across from him, Mrs. Carter stood like a sentinel, her small frame exuding a strength that belied her years. She wasn't just defending Marcus. She was making a statement to the crowd that had gathered, their phones still recording. "This isn't just about this man," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for the bystanders to hear. "It's about the assumptions we make and the power we give to those assumptions." Her words resonated with Marcus, stirring a mix of gratitude and unease. He wasn't used to being the one protected. He was the protector, the advocate, the voice for the voiceless. But today, he had no power except for the strength of his character and the hope that justice, even in this small moment, would prevail. The officer, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the pressure. His bravado had waned in the face of Mrs. Carter's unrelenting presence and the growing crowd. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered defensively, avoiding her piercing gaze. "Doing your job?" Mrs. Carter echoed, her tone sharp. "Is your job to uphold the law or to misuse it based on your own biases? Because right now it looks like you're doing the latter." The officer stiffened, his face reddening. "Look, I don't need a lecture from you, ma'am. Mrs. Carter stepped closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its edge. Then maybe you need one from him, she said, gesturing toward Marcus. Because something tells me this man knows the law better than you do. For the first time, the officer looked directly at Marcus, the unease in his expression deepening. Who are you? He asked, his voice faltering. Marcus held his gaze, his tone calm but firm. Someone who's dedicated his life to ensuring the law is applied fairly to everyone. And right now, you're proving why that work is so necessary. The officer frowned, his confidence visibly shaken. You still haven't answered my question. Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Carter interjected, her voice filled with exasperation. Do you even hear yourself? You don't need to know who he is to treat him with respect. That's the point. As the tension in the air thickened, Marcus felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Gratitude for Mrs. Carter's courage mixed with frustration at the situation's absurdity. But beneath it all was a growing resolve. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been dismissed, disrespected, or dehumanized because of ignorance or prejudice. Officer, Marcus said finally, his voice steady and commanding. Run my plates. Check my ID. Do your due diligence. But while you're doing that, think about why you stopped me in the first place. Was it because of something I did, or something you assumed? The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between Marcus and Mrs. Carter. Then, as if to assert some semblance of authority, he pulled out his radio and began running the checks. The minutes that followed felt agonizingly long, the silence punctuated only by the murmurs of the crowd. When the response came back, the officer's face turned pale. He glanced at Marcus, then quickly looked away, his posture stiffening as if bracing for impact. The realization had hit him. He had arrested the Attorney General of the state. Mrs. Carter, perceptive as ever, noticed the shift. Well, she asked, her tone sharp. Are you going to admit your mistake? Or are you going to make this worse for yourself? The officer cleared his throat, fumbling for his keys. I didn't realize, he stammered, unlocking the cuffs with trembling hands. I didn't know who you were. Marcus flexed his wrists, the cool relief of freedom doing little to ease the heaviness in his chest. He met the officer's gaze, his expression unreadable. You didn't know who I was, he repeated. But that shouldn't matter. Whether I'm the Attorney General or a mechanic or a teacher, you should treat every person with the same respect. The officer looked down, shame etched into his features. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice softening slightly. The law isn't just about rules. It's about justice. And justice starts with how we treat one another. The moment was a turning point, not just for the officer but for Marcus as well. The experience had brought him face to face with the very biases he had spent his career fighting against. It was a stark reminder that even those in positions of power weren't immune to prejudice. But it also reinforced the importance of continuing the fight for equality. The officer stood frozen, the keys to the handcuffs still trembling in his hands. The weight of his mistake hung heavy in the air, and Marcus, though freed from his restraints, remained composed. The crowd around them had grown silent, their attention fixed on what would happen next. Ma'am, the officer began awkwardly, turning to Mrs. Carter. I appreciate your concern. But this situation is resolved now. Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze unwavering. Resolved? I don't think so. You owe this man an apology, and not just because of who he is, but because of who you assumed he wasn't. Marcus placed a calming hand on her shoulder, his voice soft yet firm. Mrs. Carter, it's all right. Let me handle this. He turned to the officer, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply studied the young man, noting the fear and shame etched into his features. What's your name, officer? Marcus asked. The officer hesitated before answering. It's Daniels, sir. Officer Daniels. Daniels, Marcus repeated, his tone steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about a mindset, a way of thinking that leads to moments like this. You didn't stop me because of anything I did. You stopped me because you assumed something about me based on how I look, Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish. I could report you. I could call for disciplinary action. But what would that achieve? Would it make you see the world differently? Or would it make you more resentful? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze dropping to the ground. Marcus continued, his voice softening. What I want is for you to learn from this. To understand that the badge you wear isn't just a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of service. And that service extends to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. Mrs. Carter, still standing nearby, crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly. That's a generous way to handle things, she said, her voice quieter now. But I'd expect nothing less from a man like you. Marcus turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. You played a part in this, Mrs. Carter. You reminded me of the importance of standing up, even when it's easier to stay silent. That's a lesson we all need to remember. Later that day, Marcus found himself back in Mrs. Carter's living room. The modest space was filled with the warmth of well-loved furniture and walls adorned with family photos and bookshelves. She handed him a cup of tea, her hands steady despite the excitement of the day. I still can't believe you're the Attorney General, she said with a chuckle, settling into the armchair across from him. But I should have known. The way you carried yourself. It's not something you see every day. Marcus smiled, cradling the warm cup in his hands. And I should have known you'd be the one to step in. You didn't hesitate, even though you didn't know me. Mrs. Carter shrugged modestly. I just did what felt right. It's what I've always taught my students. If you see something wrong, speak up. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. And you were right. Too often, people stay quiet, thinking it's not their place or it's not their problem. But silence can be just as harmful as action. The experience lingered in Marcus's mind long after he left Mrs. Carter's home. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, as painful as it was, could be a catalyst for change. Not just for Officer Daniels, but for the entire community. A week later, Marcus returned to Ridgewood. This time, he wasn't alone. He had reached out to the local police department, requesting a meeting with Officer Daniels and his colleagues. The chief of police, aware of the incident, had agreed to host a workshop led by Marcus himself. Standing in front of the officers, Marcus shared his story. Not just the recent incident but his journey, the obstacles he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. He spoke about the power of empathy, the importance of seeing beyond assumptions, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. I'm not here to lecture you, he said, his voice resonating through the room. I'm here to invite you to do better, to challenge the biases you may not even realize you carry. Because when you serve with fairness and integrity, you strengthen not just the community, but yourselves. Officer Daniels sat in the audience, his expression thoughtful. As the session ended, he approached Marcus, his posture hesitant but sincere. Sir, he began, his voice low, I want to apologize again. For what I did and for what it says about me. I've got a lot to work on, and I'll do my best to be better. Marcus extended a hand, shaking Danielle's firmly. Acknowledging it is the first step. Now follow through. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and Mrs. Carter stayed in touch, their unlikely friendship blossoming. Inspired by her courage, Marcus arranged for her to speak at community events, where her wisdom and authenticity resonated deeply. For Mrs. Carter, it was a chance to leave a lasting legacy. For Marcus, it was a reminder that change often starts with ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As Marcus sat in his office one evening, reflecting on the journey, he glanced at a note Mrs. Carter had sent him after the workshop. In her tidy handwriting, it read, "Justice isn't just a word, it's a practice, and you're practicing it well." He smiled, folding the note carefully and placing it on his desk. The road ahead was long, but moments like these reminded him why he had chosen this path. To create a world where no one was judged by appearances, and everyone was treated with the dignity they deserved. The experience had transformed not just Officer Daniels but also Marcus himself. It reinforced his belief that even in moments of injustice, there was an opportunity for growth, connection, and the realization that the fight for equality was one worth continuing. Because justice wasn't just about laws, it was about people, their stories, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The evening sun cast a golden glow across Marcus Hill's office as he sat by the window, gazing at the bustling city below. In his hand, he held the note Mrs. Carter had written. Its simple words a reminder of the day that had changed not just him, but those around him. He thought back to the incident with Officer Daniels, to the look of realization on the young man's face when he discovered Marcus's identity. That moment had been a stark reflection of the prejudice still embedded in society, but it had also been a turning point. Not just for Daniels but for Marcus, too. For years, Marcus had fought for justice from the highest levels, crafting laws and policies to create a fairer system. But that day, standing on the side of the road with Mrs. Carter by his side, he was reminded of the smaller, everyday battles that shaped real change. Justice wasn't only about courtroom victories or legislative triumphs. It was about people, about speaking up when it mattered, about holding others accountable with empathy, and about showing that fairness could begin in the simplest interactions. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Mrs. Carter. The world needs more people like you, Marcus. Keep fighting the good fight. He smiled, typing a quick reply, and more people like you to remind us what's right. Setting the phone down, Marcus stood and adjusted his tie. Tomorrow, he would address a community gathering, sharing the lessons from his encounter and urging others to see beyond assumptions. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of Mrs. Carter's courage, of Officer Daniels's willingness to learn, and of the people in the crowd who had recorded the incident, their presence serving as silent witnesses to injustice. Change starts small, Marcus murmured to himself. But when it grows, it can transform everything. The room grew quieter as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving Marcus with a sense of purpose that burned brighter than ever. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to walk it, with kindness, humility, and an unshakable belief in the power of justice to unite and uplift. Because at the heart of justice was a simple truth. When we choose empathy over prejudice, courage over silence, and action over apathy, we don't just change laws, we change lives.